Before the movies got hold of him, the cowboy was just a working man. He did not ride into sunsets. He did not draw fast guns in dusty streets or serenade the frontier with a guitar by the campfire. He woke before dawn, saddled a horse in the dark, and spent the next 16 hours doing some of the most physically punishing agricultural labor the American continent has ever produced. He did this for wages that barely covered his boots, in weather that could kill him, across terrain that offered no mercy and very little shade. The cowboy emerged as a distinct figure in American working life in the years following the Civil War. The demand for beef in the expanding cities of the East was enormous. Texas had cattle, millions of them, ranging wild across the brush country of the South. The railheads that could ship those cattle east were in Kansas and Missouri, hundreds of miles north. Somebody had to move the animals from one place to the other. That somebody was the cowboy. For roughly 2 decades, from the late 1860s through the mid-1880s, the cattle drives that connected Texas ranches to northern rail depots defined an entire industry and an entire way of life. The men who rode those trails were not heroes by design. They were laborers doing a dangerous job in difficult conditions for modest pay. This documentary looks at what that job actually involved, the skills it demanded, the hierarchy it created, the hardships it inflicted, and the brief era it shaped before the modern world closed it down for good. The cattle drive was not a romantic adventure. It was a logistics operation conducted entirely in the open air, across hundreds of miles of unpredictable terrain, with thousands of live animals that had no interest in cooperating. A typical drive began in South Texas in the early spring, once the grass had grown tall enough to sustain a herd on the move. The outfit assembled for a drive was structured like a small military unit. At the top was the trail boss, usually a veteran in his 30s or 40s, a man who had made the journey before and earned the authority to make every significant decision from departure to delivery. Below him were 8 to 12 cowboys, a cook who drove the chuck wagon, and a horse wrangler responsible for managing the remuda, the string of spare horses that kept the outfit moving. Each cowboy rode through 5 or 6 horses over the course of a drive. No single animal could sustain the pace and workload for the full journey, which could stretch 1,500 miles and take 3 months. The remuda for a crew of 10 men might number 60 horses. Managing them was a full-time job in itself. The cattle, usually Texas Longhorns, bred for hardiness and capable of walking long distances on minimal water, were driven in a column that could stretch a mile from front to rear. The cowboys who rode point, at the head of the column, were the most experienced men in the outfit. Their job was to read the lead steers, set the direction, and control the pace of travel. Behind them, swing riders and flank riders kept the herd from spreading too wide across the prairie. At the back came the drag riders, choking in the dust of thousands of hooves, pushing the slow and the weak animals forward. It was the worst position on the trail, and it was almost always given to the newest and youngest men. A well-managed drive covered 10 to 15 miles per day, pushed the cattle harder and they lost condition, weight they would never recover, weight that represented money at the railhead. Moved too slowly and the outfit risked running out of grass and water before the next reliable source, or arriving too late to catch the market at its best. River crossings were among the most dangerous challenges the trail presented. At flood stage, a river could turn a manageable ford into a churning wall of water. Cattle were strong swimmers, but panicked easily. A spooked herd entering a river could pile up and drown in its own mass. Cowboys rode alongside and ahead, guiding the leaders across while trying to keep the column moving at a pace that prevented the animals from turning back. Men died at river crossings. It was not uncommon. The great trails, the Chisholm, the Western, the Goodnight Loving, were not roads in any formal sense. They were routes, defined by landmarks, water sources, and the worn ground left by the thousands of cattle that had passed before. A cowboy on his first drive might cover the full distance from South Texas to Abilene or Dodge City without once setting foot in a town or sleeping under a roof. The trail was his entire world for the duration, and the outfit around him was his entire community. The cattle set the schedule, and the cattle had no interest in anyone's comfort. On a working drive, the day began before sunrise. Cowboys were in the saddle as first light came up, pushing the herd into motion while the air was still cool enough to keep the animals calm and manageable. By midday, when summer heat made movement dangerous and the cattle grew restless and hard to handle. The drive typically halted. The herd grazed and rested through the worst of the afternoon. Then the column moved again until the trail boss found a campsite with water, ideally identified in advance, and called the halt for the night. But when the cattle rested, the cowboys did not. Horses needed to be checked for sores and shoe problems. Tack needed inspection and repair. A broken cinch or a frayed rope was not an inconvenience on a cattle drive. In the wrong moment, during a river crossing, in the opening seconds of a stampede, it was a death sentence. Every working cowboy maintained his gear with the seriousness of a man who understood the consequences of neglect. The night watch was the duty that broke sleep into fragments and tested endurance more than almost anything else the trail demanded. The herd had to be monitored through every hour of darkness, because cattle that spooked in the night could scatter across miles of open country and take days to recover, if they could be recovered at all. Cowboys worked the watch in rotating shifts of 2 hours, riding slow circles around the sleeping herd. Many sang quietly as they rode, not for their own entertainment, but because a low, continuous human voice was known to calm the animals. A sudden noise, a flash of lightning, the scent of a predator drifting in on the wind. Any of these could trigger a full stampede in seconds. When a stampede broke, the response was immediate and without hesitation. Cowboys rode hard to flank the running cattle and get ahead of the leaders, then gradually pushed the front of the herd into a wide, curving arc, turning the leaders back on themselves in a tightening spiral until the animals were milling in a circle, slowing, exhausting their panic. This was called milling the herd. Done correctly, it worked. Done incorrectly, or not done at all, cattle ran until they hit water, a canyon wall, or collapse. Men and horses died in stampedes. Sometimes dozens of cattle were lost. Roping was not a performance skill in this world. It was a daily working tool required for separating cattle, treating injuries, branding, and restraint. A cowboy who could not rope reliably was a burden to the outfit. The same standard applied to horsemanship. A man who could not ride rough terrain confidently, who could not manage a spooked animal or stay mounted during a hard cut through a herd, had no place on a working drive. The monotony between emergencies was its own kind of difficulty. Week after week of the same terrain, the same rations, the same faces, the same dust. It wore on men in ways that were less dramatic than a stampede, but no less real. Experienced trail bosses understood that managing the morale of their crew was as important as managing the condition of the herd. The cowboy of popular imagination is a white Anglo-Saxon hero, lean and taciturn, standing apart from other men by virtue of some innate frontier nobility. The actual working cowboy of the post-Civil War era was something considerably more complicated and considerably more interesting. Historians estimate that between a quarter and a third of all working cowboys in the period from roughly 1865 to 1885 were black men, many of them formerly enslaved, many from Texas, finding in the cattle industry a form of economic independence and geographic mobility that the South had violently denied them. On the trail, the racial hierarchies of the broader culture were not erased, but they were complicated. A man was judged by what he could do. A skilled black cowboy who could rope, ride, and work a herd was more valuable to a trail boss than an unskilled white one, and most trail bosses were practical enough to acknowledge it. A significant portion of the workforce was Mexican or of Mexican descent, carrying with them the vaquero traditions from which the entire North American cattle industry had been built. The word rodeo comes from the Spanish. So does lasso, corral, stampede, and ranch. The techniques the Anglo cowboy used to rope, brand, and drive cattle were borrowed, adapted, and often directly inherited from the Mexican horsemen who had been working cattle on this continent for 2 centuries before the long drives began. The debt was enormous and was rarely acknowledged. The average working cowboy was young, often very young. Many were teenagers. Men in their mid-20s with several drives behind them were considered veterans. The physical demands of the work meant that a man's most productive years in the saddle were typically between 15 and 30. After that, the accumulated injuries, broken bones poorly set, back problems from years in the saddle, hands stiffened by rope burns and cold, began to limit what the body could do. Wages reflected none of this. A working cowboy in the 1870s earned between $25 and $40 a month. The trail boss earned perhaps 75. The cattle baron who owned the herd and collected the profit at the railhead earned thousands. Many cowboys arrived at the start of a drive already in debt to their employer, having drawn advances on their wages to purchase equipment and supplies. After months on the trail, some arrived at the end of it with almost nothing in their hands. What a man spent that money on, when he had it, is also part of the record. The cattle towns at the end of the trail, Abilene, Dodge City, Wichita, were built almost entirely around separating the cowboy from his wages as quickly and efficiently as possible. Saloons, gambling houses, and other establishments catered specifically to men who had been isolated for months and were now holding 3 months' pay in a single afternoon. The cowboys who managed their money carefully were the exception. The trail towns depended on the fact that most did not. The great cattle drives did not fade slowly into history. They ended with an abruptness that surprised almost everyone involved, the result of several forces converging within a single decade to dismantle the conditions that had made the drives possible and profitable. The railroad came first. As the rail network expanded south and west through the 1870s and into the 1880s, the distance between Texas cattle country and a functional shipping point collapsed. Where the Chisholm Trail had once covered 1,500 miles between producer and market, a new rail line pushing into the Texas Panhandle or the Indian Territory reduced that distance to 100 miles, then 50. The economics of the long drive depended on the absence of an alternative. Once the alternative arrived on iron rails, the long drive became irrational. Outfits that had spent 3 months moving cattle north could now load them on a train and reach the same market in days. Barbed wire arrived almost simultaneously. Patented in 1874 by Joseph Glidden, it offered something the treeless plains had never been able to support: cheap, practical, durable fencing at a scale that could enclose hundreds of thousands of acres. Within a decade of its introduction, ranchers, homesteaders, and farming operations were enclosing land that had been open range, fragmenting the corridors through which drives had passed freely for 20 years. A trail boss who had ridden the same route in 1872 might find it impassable by fences in 1882, his path cut at every creek crossing and pasture boundary by wire that had not existed when he last made the journey. Fence-cutting wars broke out across Texas and Kansas as competing interests fought over who had the right to enclose what. The open range was ending not peacefully but bitterly. Then came the winter of 1886 to 1887, and it ended everything else. A series of blizzards struck the northern plains beginning in November of 1886 and did not relent until spring. Temperatures dropped to levels that had not been recorded in living memory. Cattle that had grazed the open range through the mild autumn with no supplemental feed had no reserves of fat to draw on. They drifted before the storms, piling up against fences and bluffs, freezing where they stood. Outfits across Montana, Wyoming, and the Dakotas lost between 30 and 60% of their herds. Some lost everything. The British and Eastern investors who had poured capital into the speculative cattle boom of the early 1880s withdrew in a matter of months. The boom collapsed. What emerged from the wreckage was a different industry, smaller, more carefully managed, built on fenced pastures and winter feeding rather than open-range grazing and seasonal migration. The men who remained in cattle work became ranch hands in the modern sense, year-round employees of a fixed operation, not seasonal laborers riding a trail. The era of the great drives had lasted, in its concentrated form, barely 20 years. By 1890, it was already history. The real cowboy left almost no record of himself. He did not write memoirs. He did not sit for portraits. He worked until his body gave out, spent whatever wages remained in whatever cattle town sat at the end of the trail, and rode south to do it again the following spring. The legend that replaced him, the stoic hero of the dime novel, the noble gunfighter of 100 films, was built by people who had never ridden a drag position through a Kansas dust storm or worked a 4-hour night watch in a thunderstorm with a nervous herd. But there is something in the gap between the myth and the reality that is worth sitting with. The cowboy's world demanded genuine mastery. He operated in conditions that would overwhelm most modern workers, and he did so with a competence that was earned, not assumed. He was also, In most cases, a man working within a system that underpaid him, extracted from him what it needed, and discarded him when the economics changed. The cattle barons got rich. The cowboys got boots and a bedroll. What the cowboy's story teaches us, stripped of the romance, is something more durable than legend. It tells us what work actually costs, in time, in the body, in the years of a young man's life. It tells us that the figures most celebrated in a culture's mythology are often the ones who were compensated the least. The open range is gone. The trails are fenced and subdivided. But those questions have never really closed.